Hello, everyone. Again, thank you so much for being here. My name is Rose Zhang, and I am the Community Outreach Advocate at Women's Advocates. And I will be guiding us through this webinar today on how domestic violence and homelessness impact survivors' mental health and wellness. If you haven't already and you would like to, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, your name, where you're from, what you do. If at all you have questions, concerns, comments, feel free to leave them into the chat. Again, I would like to read them out loud and answer them for you. We can kind of bounce off one another as we go. But thank you for being here today and for joining us. I will get us started. In today's webinar, we have 3 parts. So we will dive into part 1, which is about how domestic violence is rarely a singular issue. We'll talk more about that. And then we'll dive into part 2, so looking at the impacts of traumatic experiences on mental health and wellness. And then we'll end off with part 3, so how to build your toolbox and walk with survivors in their healing journey. As we talk about mental health and domestic violence, it could be a heavy topic, so please feel free to kind of take care of yourself however you need. Step away if you'd like, sit back and kind of just listen. Again, questions, anything at all, feel free to leave in the chat. I can read them out loud for us. And before we officially begin, Women's Advocates, we have a land acknowledgement, and I'm going to just read it out loud for us really quickly. I'm also going to copy and paste it into the chat in case anybody is interested in seeing the full land acknowledgement on our website. Feel free to click that link in the chat and it'll take you to that. But Women's Advocates work takes place on Dakota land. The area that is now St. Paul was stolen from the Dakota people by the American government through centuries of wars, broken treaties, and acts of cultural genocide. Through incredible perseverance and resistance, the Dakota are still here and strong. Native women and girls face the highest risks of domestic violence, sexual assault, and intimate partner homicide. We express our gratitude for the Indigenous-led organizations who are working each day towards a world without domestic and sexual violence. And as an organization, we commit ourselves to supporting tribal sovereignty, with the same fervor that we support the self-sovereignty of victim survivors. So with that, let's jump into part 1, domestic violence and how it's rarely a singular issue. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to launch a poll. So hopefully it'll work with me. The poll is launched. There are 3 questions in total, excuse me. Feel free to scroll down and take this poll for me. And it's kind of just to kind of gauge where you are at as an audience. It's good for me to know. So please, if you can see the poll, feel free to kind of read through it, take your time and really take the poll for me. I'll give us a couple minutes to do that here. So you have plenty of time to do it. Again, 3 questions. As you do that, again, we'll give us a couple more minutes here to do that and take your time. I know it's 3 questions, no need to rush. And then I will then stop the poll and share the results with everybody. Couple more seconds here. Okay, I am going to end the poll now and share the results. this is what a lot of you had said. So the first question, what do you think are survivors' top two primary needs? And the majority of you said housing resources and economic resources. We also have employment resources and childcare resources. These questions will be answered in the next couple of slides, and as we go, you will get your answers. However, as of right now, there's really no right or wrong answer. If you were to choose anywhere across the board, you would be right. Scrolling down, what percent of homeless women with children have experienced domestic violence? Excuse me. And majority of you said 80%. Again, these questions will be answered. Sorry, my phone is ringing. Okay, and then third question. What percent of all homeless women report domestic violence as an immediate cause of their homelessness? And majority of you said 82%, and a lot of you also said 57%. Thank you, everybody, for taking the poll. I'll stop sharing now and we can move on. Again, we will talk more about this as we go, so hang in there with me. And before we officially dive right into it, on the screen, you'll see Women's Advocates mission statement to kind of walk with victim survivors and our community to break the cycle of domestic violence. Just a little bit about our organization. We are located in St. Paul, Minnesota. And we are hitting our 50-year mark soon here in the fall. But yeah, we have 3 houses lined up in St. Paul, and we house victim survivors of domestic violence. We have a 24/7 crisis line. We offer shelter, housing stability. A big part of my job is I get to go out into the community and educate about domestic violence and giving webinars as I do right now. So yeah, that's just a little bit about us as an organization. If you do have questions, feel free to leave it in the chat. If you're interested in what we do, feel free to visit our website at womensadvocates.org. A lot of information there. So on this slide, back in 1972, a number of women working within the legal field started a legal helpline to kind of support women who were navigating divorce and a legal name change. And as they continued to do this, they realized that a lot of these women who were pursuing divorce were also in mortal danger. And a lot of them had kids, families, and they were kind of stuck with the situation that they were in. So either they were stuck in their abusive relationships, or they had to find a way to get out of that abusive relationship and face possible homelessness. And so what a lot of these women did working during this time was they would open up their homes and let people sleep on their couch. Any spare rooms that they had, basements, attics, they would let these women and children come into their homes and stay for as long as they needed. And then they quickly realized that that is, of course, not a sustainable plan. And that is where Women's Advocates started, where we were able to then save up and purchase a home in St. Paul. And again, 50 years since then, we have now expanded to 3 homes, and we house a lot more victim survivors. We are also right now transitioning into kind of buying apartments in order to house victim survivors. A lot of cool things coming for Women's Advocates, and I hope that a lot of you, if you know about us, Women's Advocates, or if you just found out about us today, I hope that you kind of keep up with our journey and trying to help victim survivors of domestic violence. Because I know a lot of your work could be very similar to what we do too. So yeah, just a little bit about Women's Advocates, what we do, our mission statement, and where we are at right now. So let's add some more facts, figures, and systems into our understanding of this connection. I am going to play a short 3-minute video. So And I never know if it's gonna work with the audio, so if you can hear it, can you please let me know in the chat if you can hear the video or not? That would be great for me to know.
Nobody should have to choose between staying in an unsafe home or having no home at all. But too often, that's the choice
Perfect. Thank you, everybody.
survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault have to make. Studies show that access to safe, affordable housing is one of survivors' biggest, most urgent concerns. This is why we can't end homelessness without addressing domestic and sexual violence. More than 80% of women with children who are experiencing homelessness have experienced domestic violence. And women are at a heightened risk of sexual assault before, during, and after periods of homelessness. Survivors of violence face real barriers when trying to access housing. Barriers caused by the power and control dynamics of abuse, a need for safety and confidentiality, economic instability, and the effects of trauma. And these barriers are often greater for those who are most marginalized in our society, including families of color, Native Americans, immigrants, LGBTQ people, people with disabilities, and individuals and families living in poverty or who are geographically isolated. So if we are going to end homelessness, we have to understand the connections between domestic violence, sexual violence, and housing instability, and create a framework that responds to the unique challenges and opportunities this intersection creates. In order to meet the needs of survivors and their families, we also need a greater range of housing options, from emergency shelters to transitional housing, to rapid rehousing, to permanent supportive housing. We need to continue to build the capacity of housing and homelessness programs to support survivors' safety, autonomy, and self-determination. And we need to build and strengthen partnerships between domestic and sexual violence organizations and housing and homelessness programs at the local, state, and national levels. These partnerships will give us the resources, strategies, and support we need as advocates, and the programs and policies that will support survivors' safety and stability. Together, through partnerships like these and survivor-centered policies and practices, we can end homelessness and improve families' lives. Learn more about survivor-centered housing at
So, have any of you seen that video before? And did you catch some of the answers from the polls that you were taking before in that video? So to answer the polls from earlier, in case anybody missed it, survivors' primary needs are housing and economic resources. A lot of you answered that, the top two answers, and a lot of you got that right. So very proud as the host, and well done. 80% of homeless women with children have experienced domestic violence. That was also one of the top answers. And 57% of homeless women report domestic violence as an immediate cause of their homelessness. The website that we're at the end of the video, yes, absolutely. So sorry, I moved on a little too quickly there. But once the webinar is over and we are sending out all the information with the recorded info and everything, you will get the information to that. Thank you for letting me know. But a lot of your answers that you answered earlier to the poll were exactly what was said in the video. So again, as a host, working in the field, very, very happy, very pleased that a lot of you knew that. So well done. And so, knowing this now, does any of this surprise you? And why do you think these percentages are so high? And oftentimes when we ask this question, a lot of people tend to say like, no, these numbers don't really surprise me. Or they know that it's a high number, but it's not something that phases them. It's almost expected that these numbers should be high, which of course should not be the case, right? So why do we think these percentages are so high, and why is that the case? So continuing to underscore the connection between domestic violence and homelessness is this HUD homelessness definition, and the fact that domestic violence has its own definition. So on category 4, that speaks on the commonality of facing homelessness when experiencing domestic violence, whether that's because the family is running in fear of their lives, were evicted due to the actions of an abusive person, like destruction of property, inability to pay rent due to an abusive person denying the survivor's ability to work, or were otherwise displaced from their home for reasons related to domestic violence. And we also just want to emphasize this to anybody who may not be familiar or may not know that leaving an abusive relationship is the most dangerous time for a victim survivor. So a lot of times you would hear people say things like, why not just up and leave? Why not just, get your kids, pack your things, and get out of the house? And it's not that easy. There are many, many barriers to leaving an abusive relationship. And just because you are out of the relationship, out of the house, whatever, it doesn't mean that you are safe. Again, many, many barriers. And so we always want to emphasize this message any chance we get at Women's Advocates, that leaving an abusive relationship is the most dangerous time. This is where the most homicides happen, the most murder happens. So we want to very much be understanding of why a victim survivor would choose to stay in a domestic relationship, even if it's, of course, not ideal. And as advocates and people who work in this field, we want to do our best to help them in any way that we can. So on this slide, the amount of available shelter beds, which was estimated to be around 417 in the Twin Cities, does not begin to meet the immediate housing needs of survivors. So many people think that emergency shelters are sustainable solutions for survivors, but it is merely a short temporary way from facing the housing shortages and crises. So for more long-term units and spaces, we need to do more and we need to do better for that, because a lot of victim survivors who come into shelter are able to stay here for a certain amount of time. And during that time, they are also seeking all sorts of help, like employment help, housing stability help, mental health help. And a lot of that needs to be done in the short amount of time where they are in shelter. And so shelters are, of course, there to help victim survivors if they are in need of shelters. But in the long run, it is not a sustainable choice. And they need permanent housing. And so again, connecting back to the poll that we did earlier, a lot of you answered right that a lot of victim survivors need housing resources. So what do you think are some additional barriers that survivors face when accessing safe and affordable housing? Kind of think about that as we go here, because many of the barriers mentioned are listed on the screen here. So some barriers that you may have thought of just now, if you were thinking about it, could be listed on the screen here. So in addition to these unique barriers, survivors are affected by the same economic barriers and challenges so many individuals around the nation. So unemployment, things like the lack of affordable housing, rent is rising regardless of people's ability to pay, lack of living wage jobs, ineffective or absent social safety nets, all compound the stress that many survivors face. And even if you are not a victim survivor of domestic violence, maybe you have faced this yourself, or you see the issue yourself. You face some sort of issue like this, or you hear it all the time with the people you work with friends and family. You know that it's an issue. So at places like Women's Advocates, we have housing stability advocates, but not all survivors have that kind of continued support as they navigate housing and other systems. So another aspect to consider is what survivors learn throughout this grueling, intense maze-like process of accessing support. And I invite you to think about being told, again, telling victim survivors to simply just leave, just up and leave your relationship. Um, as someone who has experienced a pattern and dynamic of abuse, and then facing all of these barriers to housing, stability, economic resources, what lessons do they begin to learn? What do victim survivors begin to learn here? What stories do they create about themselves and about their lives? Just because when we tell people to kind of just up and leave their abusive relationship, we are getting into a victim blaming mentality. And that is not something that we want to be proud of. That is not something that we want to practice. So many survivors through this process begin to think and kind of internalize thoughts like, um, nothing will ever work out for me, or my abusive partner was right. Um, Me leaving my abusive partner was the wrong choice. I made the wrong choice to leave. Um, or that no one is there for me, no one wants to help me, and that it's my fault that I'm being abused, stuff like that. And so again, we, as much as we can, want to get rid of a victim blaming mentality, and we want to kind of just show sympathy and empathy to those who are going through an abusive relationship and is finding it hard to leave an abusive relationship because of all the different ways that is stopping a victim survivor from leaving their abusive partners. Everything listed on the screen here, and just so much more. So on the screen here, these quotes contextualize everything we know about domestic violence with the experience of homelessness. So paying attention to these contexts kind of illuminates us for us to have to know how many survivors end up feeling really depleted and deteriorated when, of course, going through abuse, but also trying to escape abuse. So survivors who have experienced homelessness have been some of the most, resilient, compassionate, and gratitude-filled individuals that we have ever worked with here at Women's Advocates. And they have scars, visible scars and invisible scars. And we want to keep that in mind, that these are a result of living in survival mode all the time. And for extended periods of time, they are often in survival mode and often with no sense of security or safety. So when we, again, work with victim survivors, trying to get rid of the victim blaming mentality and just understanding why victim survivors feel hopeless. So any questions or comments, please, again, feel free to leave it in the chat. Because we are at part 2 of the webinar. So looking at the impact of traumatic experiences on mental health and wellness. So this next session, again, is about mental health, wellness, and how that's impacted by traumatic experiences of both domestic violence and homelessness. And we've been talking a lot about systems, and now we're going to kind of contextualize all of that and more nuanced dynamics of abuse within a relationship. So on the screen is the cycle of abuse. Many of you have probably seen the cycle of abuse before. If not, feast your eyes on your screen. There are debates about how helpful this model can be. One common misconception by people who haven't experienced domestic violence is that domestic violence is an isolated event. And you'll hear landlords or police officers say there's a domestic incident or event all the time. But it is not a one-time isolated event. So domestic violence is not just a one-time thing. It is a pattern of behavior that an abuser causes and a victim has to live within it. So the cycle can be helpful in affirming that not every waking second is horrific and bad, And there are moments like the honeymoon phase where apologies and promises of change are made and hope is instilled into the victim survivor. The hope, that hope keeps the victim survivors in the relationship or leads them to feel that they're exaggerating the harm being caused upon them, again, overreacting, or they, again, get into that mindset that it's their fault that they are being abused because there are good moments. And if they aren't receiving all the good moments, then it's their fault that they're being abused. And of course, that is not the case. And maybe there's calm where everything seems okay at times. Survivors might say, things like, I want to be with this person, the person that the abuser is when they aren't abusive and controlling. But as you think about this cycle, the actions visible to people inside and outside of the relationship, it's important to know that this cycle is often triggers another cycle for victim survivors, and that would be the cycle of anxiety. So just going back, we have the cycle of abuse. We have when tension builds up, the abusive incident happens. We have the honeymoon phase where the abuser can be very, very loving, apologetic to the victim survivor, promising change, and the victim survivor then deciding to kind of stay in the relationship or come back. There is then a sense of calm for a period of time, and then we go straight back to where tension builds again. And on this slide, we have the cycle of anxiety. Um, and while the cycle of abuse is going on, the survivors is learning its patterns, and the tension causes anxiety. The abuse causes the survivor to seek refuge when the abuser goes to work or when the survivor leaves the house. And maybe they use, oftentimes drugs or alcohol to kind of escape the anxiety and pain, which often is called avoidance, in order to avoid, of course, the anxiety. And the honeymoon phase causes short-term relief from the anxiety, where, again, hope would then build up. But then the brain, of course, remembers the pattern of anxiety, even as the survivor tries to avoid it. And that anxiety never fully goes away. And then the cycle again repeats itself. So as Leslie Morgan says, domestic violence is a carefully laid physical, financial, and psychological trap. Consider the lasting impact that can have on someone living in this, seemingly never-ending cycle of chaos and distress. I would like you all to kind of, if you will, write in the chat in this process, what is the survivor learning? Maybe even think about how you and your profession can act to kind of disrupt this cycle, or how knowing this cycle can help you support the people you work with. And we'll talk about that more in the third section. But yeah, if you want to write in the chat, feel free to do so. And is this your first time hearing about the cycle of anxiety? And what are your thoughts on it? Again, talking about anxiety, I feel like you don't necessarily have to be a victim survivor of domestic violence to understand what anxiety feels like. And that's where we get to really relate with victim survivors, is we know what that feeling feels like, and it's not a good feeling. And so when you add abuse on top of it, of course, it's going to be more complex. So again, if you are typing, feel free to type anything into the chat as we go. Just because I moved on to the next slide doesn't mean you should, not type anything. But on this slide, we have how domestic violence impacts the person as a whole. So I want to take a moment to zoom out and ground us all in the notion that there are more than just the emotional and physical dimensions of health. And we could talk about how all these dimensions are impacted. Another time, we have different webinars that focuses specifically on how domestic violence impacts a person as a whole. But we're going to focus on why emotional wellness is often targeted by abusers. And oftentimes your emotional wellness, when working with victim survivors is often neglected, because people tend to try and physically stay safe because they are, again, on survival mode all the time. And so physical safety is the first thing, and a lot of people tend to neglect everything else. But today we will be diving more into emotional health and emotional safety. And again, emotional abuse can impact all of these other dimensions of health too. So abusers can identify what tactics will be the most effective in weaponizing this emotional aspect. And we hear the following from victim survivors. On the screen, it says, "It is not the bruises on the body that hurt, it is the wounds of the heart and the scars on the mind." And the second quote is, "For too long, I couldn't tell my story because I didn't know how to make sense of a reality where the person I loved deliberately hurt me. What happened to me is not about physical violence, it's about how they get you turned all upside down. It's about how emotional abuse wraps the weave of your narrative, making you think you deserve what's happening to you." Um, and on this slide, we have dimensions of wellness. Again, just diving deeper into the emotional wellness of things. So what exactly is emotional wellness, and why don't abusers want survivors to have it? So emotional wellness is your strength and your resilience, your ability to survive and adapt to change in a way that keeps your sense of self intact. If emotional wellness is degraded and eroded, often in small ways over a long period of time, because again, keep in mind, domestic violence isn't just a one-time incident, it is a pattern of behavior that happens over a long period of time. A survivor's ability to adapt can diminish, which can make it really challenging to leave the abusive person. So people whose emotional wellness is abused may begin to think that they deserve what is happening to them and that they're incapable of making moves out of their situation. Abusive people target their partner's emotional wellness because it's one of the most effective ways to keep the partner under control. When we talk about domestic violence, we are again talking about power and control. Some of you may know about the power control, a lot of you may not. Again, we have different webinars and different topics focusing on domestic violence, power control wheel, and just everything diving deep into that. So this speaks again to the intentional and strategic nature of abuse, of an abuser always wanting to have control over their victim survivors, and then would oftentimes go after their emotional well-being. So with that being said, in the chat, if you would like to answer this question, how have you seen survivors' emotional wellness impacted by abuse? Have you, been in an abusive relationship? Have you worked with anybody? Do you know anybody in that situation? And it doesn't have to be super deep and detailed and thought out. Just kind of think to yourself, how have you seen survivors' emotional wellness impacted by abuse? What does that look like? What are the signs there that you have seen? Somebody said low self-esteem. That is a very, very good one, very, very big one. Absolutely. Again, feel free to type those into the chat, even as I move on. Feel free to say them anyway. Isolating themselves. Yep. Let me. Difficulty making decisions about their own life. Absolutely. They live with an underlying fear that erodes their sense of freedom. Yep. Consistently apologizing. Feeling of unworthiness, lack of confidence, blaming themselves for everything, not trusting, lack of motivation, or willing to live. Absolutely. So again, as I host this webinar, a lot of you know your stuff. Makes my job a little easier. But also it's good for me to know that a lot of you, are on the same page. A lot of you understand. A lot of you know how a victim survivor would feel. when their emotional well-being is being abused. So again, just good to know that we are all on the same page when it comes to that. I am going to launch another poll here. It'll work with me. There we go. So again, 2 questions here. Please scroll down to take the second question. But if you will, take your time and take that poll for me. I will give us a couple minutes to do so. And as you do that, I will continue just kind of talking about mental health coercion. One way the trauma of abuse can impact emotional wellness is through direct experiences of mental abuse. So you might be wondering, do people actually experience abuse that targets their mental health? And the answer is a resounding yes. And a term you may know associated with it is mental health coercion. So 89% of hotline callers, in other words, survivors, which is about 2,741 people, have experienced at least one type of mental health coercion. Most of the callers who reported any type of reported abuse more than once, oftentimes have experienced mental health coercion. And for example, many callers who reported that their abusive partner called them quote unquote crazy and did things deliberately to make them feel crazy, also reported that their partners threatened to undermine their credibility with authorities and discourage or prevented them from getting help. So the last 2 points on the screen are quotes from author Kelly. And it says, "It looks like a sunset if you haven't read it yet. I would highly, recommend it." And these 2 particular quotes on the screen is something that we, often talk about when we talk about mental health coercion at Women's Advocates. So give us a couple more seconds to take the poll, and then I will end it and share the results with everyone. Okay. I will end the poll now and share what everybody had said. Okay, so question 1, what is your current familiarity with mental health coercion? And we have answers all across the board, no right or wrong answers here. But majority of you said, I have an idea of what it is. And a lot of you also said, I've learned about it before, which is, again, great for me to know. The second question, in a survey of 2,000 plus crisis line callers, what percentage of survivors do you think have reported experiencing mental health coercion? And majority of you said 89%. Again, answers all across the board, but yes, those of you who said 89% is absolutely right. 89% of hotline callers have reported experiencing mental health coercion. Thank you, everybody, for taking that poll. But yeah, mental health coercion, again, something that we emphasize and talk about all the time at Women's Advocates when we give webinars, just because this is such a big topic that often is overlooked. When victim survivors are going through things mentally and emotionally, people tend to overlook their mental and emotional well-being. So, and it's good for me to know that a lot of you are already familiar with mental health coercion and what that looks like and sounds like. So we can start to kind of understand how survivors are impacted by both domestic violence and housing instability by looking at both experiences, effects on survivors' emotional regulation system. So on the screen are 3 circles, each corresponding with a different system. So we have the drive, threat, and soothing system. They are all intended to work together to keep someone emotionally regulated, safe, secure, striving, and calm. So this system gets disrupted by threats to one's survival and what are domestic violence and housing instability, if not threats to one's survival. Both of the experiences are often chronic and occur over extended periods of time. And an initial response to abuse and housing stability can look like an overreactive threat system where there's a disproportionate focus on self-protection. And they may constantly be on guard, scanning the room, needing to see if there's an exit nearby. Again, you see this all the time when working with victim survivors, where they are always on guard. And we just, again, want to understand that this is because they are, again, on that survival mode where they need to be safe at all times. There needs to be an exit if the abuser is in the room. They need to feel safe if anything were to happen to them or their children. And it becomes a mindset every person and situation gets kind of like a threat scan. And many things are perceived as a threat, even when they may not be a threat, because thinking and acting this way may have saved them in the past from some kind of harm. And so victim survivors learn that it's effective, and so they keep doing it. And their soothing muscles tend to kind of dwindle from disuse. So when a stressful situation occurs, threat systems are activated and emotions heighten. Connections with other people or ways to kind of rest and recharge aren't prioritized or valued. And they aren't cool down after a crisis. So on the other hand, some survivors lean into their drive system, becoming overachievers or workaholics. And maybe their work is attached to their productivity, or work is an escape form to kind of deal with the pain. So yeah, we have just different ways that victim survivors tend to kind of regulate their system and find ways to be safe. They're either always on the lookout um, and being in this survival mode all the time, overachievers, or they're just not using this soothing system enough and they are always, again, in a state of distress. So not being able to effectively access our drive, soothing, and threat systems can manifest in a lot of different ways for survivors. Studies and direct experiences working with survivors, have found that people who have experienced domestic violence have higher than average rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, generalized anxiety, disorder, suicidal ideation, changes in productivity, concentration, memory loss, cognition, and arousal. And we often hear from survivors that they have learned to not think highly of themselves, and that they have trouble navigating their lives on their own. So again, just kind of tying back to what you all said in the chat earlier about having low self-esteem. Absolutely right. Um, and we talk about the periods of time after a survivor is able to leave an abusive relationship as a newfound freedom stage, when survivors are rediscovering who they are, what they like, who they want to be, what they want to do with their life, what they want to do with their time and energy now that they have it back. Because these are all things an abusive partner dictated for them. And the survivor had grown accustomed to control. And again, all about power control, right? So the abuser is over here controlling everything that they do, from what they wear to how they speak to how they act. And so every chance we get when working with victim survivors, giving them the chance to really live their life, make their own decisions, becoming who they are, we want to give them that freedom to do so. So let's dive into part 3. The how-to, building your toolbox to walk with survivors on their healing journey. So we're going to kind of, in this section, we'll introduce some skills and approaches and provide space for you to kind of think about integrating some of this information into your connections with the people in your life who have experienced abuse in your workplace, with yourself, friends or family, in your personal sphere. So yeah, let's jump right into it. So again, just a couple more quotes on the screen. I can read it out loud for us. The first one says, trauma creates change, and you don't choose. Healing is about creating change. You do choose. The second one says, recovery is based upon the empowerment of the survivor and the creation of new connections. Recovery can take place only within the context of relationship. It cannot occur in isolation. So the reason we talk so much about healing is because with healing comes the opportunity to regain one's personal agency and the ability to make your own decisions, and having the freedom to do that in the long run can be very, very beneficial for victim survivors. So having people like yourselves be equipped with these skills and ability to hold space for victim survivors is pivotal to the journey of healing and recovering from trauma. And so this is really diving into what can we do to help victim survivors. So continuing with the notion that healing happens in relationships, think about how these tips on the screen could be integrated into your work, and we're gonna walk through all 6 of them very briefly here. So many of you may have heard of a strengths-based approach before, and this is in line with focusing on what is right with the survivor. So acknowledging the self-esteem deterioration that often happens in an abusive relationship and creating a dynamic that explores, validates, and centers the survivor's strengths. Another important consideration is to acknowledge power dynamics. So inherently in a helper or a helpy dynamic, there is someone who holds a position of power. Actively work with the survivor to solidify roles and expectations of each other, find ways to engage in non-coercion, and create space for the survivor to kind of reclaim their agency in this space. For authentic connection, embrace the commonality that you're both complex, nuanced human beings. Make space to bond regarding things outside of their trauma experiences. And it goes beyond building rapport and to the importance of feeling seen, heard, and respected as is. So when we honor the survivor's story, avoid making assumptions, create space for survivors to share parts of their experiences as they feel comfortable and safe to, meet their sharings with compassion. Again, we never want to kind of get into a victim blaming mentality. So every time we get to really listen to their stories and have empathy and compassion, we want to do that. And then meeting the survivor where they currently are at. Many helpers have a vision for where they would like their client or a victim survivor to be. And while setting goals and moving forward is an important piece of the puzzle, being with the survivor in their current state is where the work begins. Sometimes that is what the survivor needs. That's all they really need, is for you to really sit with them and be in the moment with them. And last but not least, we have defining what survivors focus and what their driven healing means to them. So creating a balance between helping a survivor build their tool belt for resources, and again, just letting the victim survivor take the wheel and deciding for themselves what is good for them, making their own decisions, and becoming who they are on their healing journey. So for the remaining slides, we will be discussing specific tools that you can add to your toolbox for walking with survivors on their healing journey, from experiencing both domestic violence and housing instability. There are 6 components that pertains to a trauma-informed lens. So we have trust, safety, collaboration, choice, empowerment, and compassion. So what do these words mean to you within the context of your work? If you would like to share that in the chat, feel free to do so. It's also on the screen. Share what is a specific example of how you could put these values into action in your work with survivors. Somebody said peer-led, absolutely. And so on the screen is a concrete example for how you can incorporate that theme into your work with survivors. So for example, small acts to show them that I do what I say, I'll do, and I hold myself accountable for when I don't. Or saying things like your emotional and physical safety is a priority to us. What can we do to help you feel safe? Again, really validating the victim survivor and centering their safety is always a good thing to do when we are working with them. We then have tool number 2, so implementing a collaborative approach to assessment. One component of a trauma-informed approach is that we wanted to highlight the collaborative part of this. So specifically, excuse me, how we can take a collaborative approach to the assessment, the relationship between an advocate, a caseworker, or an ally, and a survivor can be a collaborative partnership. So making a shift from saying I assess a survivor's needs to I help the survivor assess their own needs, again, giving them the authority to make their own decisions. You're asking leading questions, not assuming, and allowing them to answer it on their own every chance that they get. And so on the screen are some questions that you can use to kind of work with survivors as they identify their primary needs and opportunities for you to support them in a way that is specific to them and their situation. And it's important to keep in mind that many survivors have never been asked these questions before, believe it or not. So they may need space and time to reflect and get back to you when they feel ready and when they trust you enough with that information. So give them time to kind of process what is crucial and restoring a sense of agency. And we're following the survivor in the lead, and we are there to kind of just support them as we go. So if you've ever had issues, trying to work with victim survivors, not knowing what to say or ask, these things on the screen is always good to ask. So for example, if you have to name the biggest challenge in your life right now, what would that be? What does the life you want look like? What barriers are in the way of that life right now? These are all great questions to ask when working with victim survivors on their healing journey. So again, we are in the passenger seats and we are letting them steer the wheel, and we are letting them figure out their own life, their own healing journey, and we are there to simply support the decisions that they make. So sometimes survivors and programs participants may be overwhelmed, of course, traumatized, a lot of times frustrated and afraid that they can't immediately identify what their needs are, especially when you've been on survival mode for so long and you need to know what the next steps are, what you need to do to survive. When you have that chance to kind of slow down, it can be a little frustrating. And we want to emphasize that that is okay. And you can provide them with options, a short list of common problems participants need assistance with, along a list of services your program provides, what you can do as an individual to kind of help them. And maybe they don't identify childcare as a need at first, but you show them a list of services that they realize would be helpful. And maybe in the future, they might need that resources. You never know. So try to structure your intakes and assessments and other meetings to allow time for participants to kind of process and understand what is going on, that what is it that they need specifically. And a lot of times, to emphasize this, patience is key. A lot of patience is needed. Give participants enough time to kind of develop a clear picture of their needs and what you can help them with. And a lot of times it's okay if you don't know everything and you aren't able to help them with everything. If not given enough time and patience, the victim survivors may identify something that isn't actually a need. So just the first thing that comes to mind, or just, kind of listing things that they don't necessarily need. And so oftentimes we want to be patient when working with them and really letting them take that wheel again and make these decisions for themselves, even if it takes a while. So for our third tool on our survivor's whole self, um, our third offering to you all is back to this graphic. We saw this a couple slides back. While abusive people may target emotional wellness, we know that abuse can negatively impact all dimensions of wellness again. So there are opportunities for growth in healings in each of these various dimensions. And how do you think you can honor survivors' whole selves? Kind of think about that to yourself. How do you think you can honor that and support the person rather than the symptoms or singular aspects of their life? Because they experience all of these impacts all at once, and we have to kind of tackle it all at once. So if you are an advocate, if you have worked with victim survivors or people who have experienced similar situations, domestic violence situations in their life, you know that it's a lot of work just because a lot of damage has been done. And now it is your job to kind of tackle everything all at once. So it's a lot, which is why we also want to emphasize the importance of self-care to take care of yourself as well. So in the chat, if you would like to, feel free to answer the question. Choose one or two dimensions of wellness that you don't tend to focus on. What is a strategy that you could implement that would support this dimension of wellness for a survivor? And again, very unique to you, no right or wrong answers here. Would be good to know. Think about that and type it into the chat if you'd like. And then we have tool number 4. So the second to last tool is to kind of encourage providers to truly meet survivors where they are in their healing journey. We talked about this in part 2, I believe, is to really just meet the survivors where they are at. One way of being able to facilitate that process is to familiarize survivors with language that describe where they are and where they want to be, which is why we have a whole list on the screen right now. In the words of philosopher Ludwig, it says the limits of my language means the limits of my world. In her book, At Last of the Heart, Brene Brown, who we love here at Women's Advocates, expands on the importance of language, saying that language is our portal to meaning, making connections, healing, learning, and self-awareness. And without accurate language, we struggle to get the help we need. So naming an experience gives us the power of understanding and meaning. So with that in mind, take a look at these words on the screen again. We show this to victim survivors all the time about where they are at in their journey right now. And this kind of describes different paths on our perspectives, our respective healing journeys. And so regardless of whether we experience domestic violence or not, we all may be healing from something. So I want you to kind of identify what path or paths you are on, because you could be on more than one. So there are 17 in total on the screen. So take your time with this, and really kind of just read through it. And if you would like to kind of think about where you are right now on your path and your journey in life, feel free to write that into the chat. We can kind of bounce off one another, kind of practice working with victim survivors and talking with them. But yeah, if you would also like to write in the chat and answer any of the following questions. Number one, what path do you think you're on right now? Number two, what path do you think most survivors are on when you start to work with them? And number three, how can we meet ourselves and others where they are currently at? If you are experienced with this, if you've done this before, feel free to leave any tips and tricks into the chat so we can absolutely bounce off one another as we go. But yeah, if you're still typing in the chat, feel free to continue doing that. I am going to move on to tool number 5. Somebody said renewing. I love that. And though we might not know each other's stories, intimately like that, it's still good to know where you are on your journey, wherever you are in life. And so somebody said renewing. I love that for you. Somebody said healing. Yep, a big one, a big one. And as you type that into the chat, and as I continue to talk, I am going to launch our last poll of the day. Feel free to take that poll for me. There are 2 questions, so you have to scroll down again. But yeah, feel free to take that poll for me and I will share the results with us after. But as you do that, I will continue to talk about tool number 5. So we have the last tool. And at Women's Advocates, we honor both trauma-informed modalities and healing-centered engagements approaches. So we have another person, Dr. Sean, coined this approach and describe the following 6 components. We have empathy, imagination, reflection, calm, contain, and care. Take a moment to kind of, we can take a moment to kind of read through these descriptions, and then, I will give us a couple minutes to take the poll, and then I will share the results. But when we are integrating a healing-centered engagement approach, we of course have empathy, which is being vulnerable, open, and honest. This will encourage survivors to do the same if it is safe for them to do so. Imagination, so encouraging survivors to imagine and dreaming is critical to fostering a sense of hope. Reflection, critical reflection entails examining one's response to trauma and taking actions to build power and control back into their life. We have calm, practicing calm, centeredness, and gentle breathing, and model it for the survivor you are working with. We have contained, so only ask for a level of trauma detail that is critical to healing, and do not ask for more than is needed. Again, if the victim survivor feels safe enough to tell you, they will. If they don't, we want to respect that. And then we have care, so practice compassion for yourself, for survivors, and for others around you. I'll give us a couple more seconds to take the poll, and I will share the results. I'm also reading the chat. Somebody said, when I meet with survivors in the legal clinic, they are at a reflecting stage and struggling with being able to move forward with a restraining order against their abuser. That is absolutely a very common thing to happen, even working with victim survivors here in shelter. A lot of times, we want to offer all the resources and help that we can, but ultimately it is their choice. To the person who said that into the chat, I don't know how things kind of work where you are, but working with victim survivors at a shelter, and everything that we've learned today, we want to give them that choice. And if they choose not to, we want to respect that, as hard as that may be. And oftentimes we want to do what's best for them, which is why we offer them all sorts of resources, like restraining orders. And it seems like you are doing all that you can, and you're doing your best to help them. But if they choose ultimately not to, we really don't have the right to force them to. And so, again, that is just how we work with victim survivors in shelter, just because we want to give them that choice too. I'm not sure how things kind of work at the legal clinic that you work. I would love to know more about that. Because again, that would be great for me to know too, as someone who works with victim survivors when it comes to restraining orders. Somebody says, their focus has been on helping survivors redefine and rebuild their lives. Absolutely. We encourage that all the time. So any chance you get to do that for yourself or for others, highly, highly appreciated. I am going to finally end this poll. This is the last poll for the day. Thank you, everybody, for taking the poll and sticking with me and taking all of these polls. So, which of the following centered engagement components do you already do really well? A lot of you said empathy. Majority of you said empathy. We have answers all across the board. Some people said care, contain, calm, reflection. Not a lot of people said reflection. Matter of fact, nobody said not reflection, excuse me, imagination. Nobody said imagination at all, which is interesting. But a lot of you said empathy, and a lot of you already do empathy really well, which is, again, great to know. When we work with victim survivors, I feel like even if you've never been through abuse or you have been through abuse, you're able to connect on a human level. And so empathy is always great to have. Number two, which of the healing-centered engagement components do you want to continue to improve and focus on? And this one, we have answers all across the board. Again, more people answered imagination. A lot of people said empathy, imagination. The top two would be reflection, imagination, and empathy. Top three. Okay, good to know. Good to know. And as you see the integration of healing-centered engagements on the screen, hopefully you are able to put that into the words. Because again, no right or wrong answers here. Thank you, everybody, for taking that poll. Thank you. Sorry, I had a couple issues here with technology. But as we move on, now that you've kind of identified which components of healing-centered engagement that you would like to grow or focus on, we have some suggestions in the form of open-ended questions that you can ask survivors in your life. So kind of just reading a couple out loud for us as examples. For example, for empathy, asking questions like, would you like to take a break before we talk about what happened? Or I noticed that you've had a hard time focusing. Is there anything you would like to talk about? Again, open-ended questions. If you've ever worked with victim survivors and you don't really know where to start, you don't really know what to ask or what to say, these are just a couple questions that you can kind of keep in mind to ask if you're ever working with anyone. If there's any other questions or anything that you say when working with victim survivors, feel free to, again, leave that into the chat. We can kind of bounce off one another and learn from one another. Another question you can ask for something like calm is, have you heard of the 4-7-8 breathing? And we can try it together. The longer exhales help activate the rest and digest part of our nervous system. This is something that we do in our support groups. I'm going to talk about that as we end off here, but something that we do all the time is the 4-7-8, excuse me, breathing with victim survivors, and we oftentimes get good feedback on it. So if you would like to participate in something like that, or if you know people who can use that, feel free to do that with them. So wrapping all of this together, we wanted to ensure that some housing resources were a part of your toolbox as well. And we have a pretty comprehensive housing resources on our website that we've linked on this slide. But we also want to encourage you all to kind of inform survivors about their rights to housing when it comes to breaking their lease as a result of abuse, um, and not being able to be lawfully evicted due to calls for help. So, for example, calling the police, um, as well as options they have for protective orders, and to know more about Minnesota's safe at home address confidentiality programs. And we have a few application assistance at Women's Advocates. So you can always call our crisis line and be connected with someone at our org who can make these appointments with the survivors seeking any type of service. We also want to encourage you to be involved politically, especially on a state level, paying attention to legislations and decisions about rent control, fundings for shelters, affordable housing for large families, um, can directly support survivors. Um, and lastly, it can be helpful to know about eviction expungements if having that on a survivor's rental history is causing property managers to immediately decline someone's applicant. So just a lot of resources that we have in case you ever need them, or anybody that you know or is working with would ever need them. And again, after this webinar, once we send all these things out, you will get more information to everything that's on the screen. Links and everything will be sent to you. And lastly, as we wrap up this webinar, we want to remind you that the way we respond to someone's experience of abuse is extremely impactful, and it can validate what the abusive person has ingrained, or it can challenge it and promote change. So on the screen are some suggestions for concrete things you can say to survivors to acknowledge and validate the emotional impacts of abuse and center their agency. So saying things like it's okay to cry, or you might just want to sit and relax for a bit. You can do that here. Let's take time to kind of sort things out together, then decide what you want to work on first. So again, really centering the victim survivors, their safety, and where they are at currently in their life and their healing journey. So sometimes if you don't necessarily know what to say, again, you don't know what to say, don't know what to really ask a victim survivor when you are trying to meet them in the moment. A lot of these things, a lot of these quotes on the screen are exactly what you can say to kind of center victim survivors when working with them. And with that, we have reached the end of this webinar, kind of. These are just more resources available to you, hotlines, websites that you can visit, Women's Advocates website that you can visit, in case you or anybody you know may need these resources. We have further readings throughout this webinar. If anything that you were interested in or wanted to know more about, feel free to kind of look through this. These slides will be sent out to you. So feel free to kind of look through it afterwards if you would like. Resources to support victim survivors. Right here is just a lot of a link, a plug to Women's Advocates, if you will, about a post-webinar survey. I feel like as you end the webinar today, you should also get this survey, but in case you don't, it is in the chat. A lot of links coming your way right now. To kind of promote a little bit more about Women's Advocates, we do have an online survivor support group. So if you or anyone you know who is going through abuse or have gone through abuse and would like to join our support group, have them contact us. If you can, scan this QR code on the screen right now for yourself and let them know about us. We will be in contact with them if they sign up. So looking forward to that. We also do pop-up advocacy. You can find us out in the public. Feel free to come up and talk to us about domestic violence. I will be there during these dates and times at these locations. So feel free to come through, come talk to us about domestic violence. If you have questions, if you have pamphlets or resources that you would like us to hand out and talk about for your organizations, we would love to do that too. So, and with that, We are at the end of today's webinar. Again, a lot of links coming your way right now, so bear with me, last home stretch. The link that I just put in the chat is the PDF to all of the slides. Feel free to click on that. If there's anything throughout the slides that you want to see more in depth of, feel free to click on that link. It'll take you straight to the slides. You can save that. If you would like to sign up for our monthly emails at Women's Advocates, find out what we're up to, what our next webinars will be, just anything that we have planned for the future and you would like to be a part of, feel free to click that link that I just copy and pasted into the chat. And of course, the link that everybody wants is the certificate of attendance. This will be sent out to you afterwards too. However, this is, of course, the most important link that everybody wants. You sat with me for over an hour listening to me talk about domestic violence and everything of the sort, and you participated in polls and everything. You deserve a certificate for that. So I just copy and pasted that into the chat. Feel free to click on that link, download that certificate. It is yours. Write your name, the date, everything on it. It is yours. Yeah, but if you would like to scan the QR code on the screen to download a copy of today's presentation, feel free to do so. But other than that, we are at the end of today's webinar. Thank you, everybody, for being here, for sticking through this whole thing, for being interested in domestic violence and homelessness, and for wanting to learn more. Hopefully, you were able to learn something new today. But yeah, thank you so much. All of our contact information is on the screen. If you ever have questions, comments, concerns, feel free to email us at our outreach email. We will get back to you as soon as we can. Other than that, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to me talk and for participating. And I hope that a lot of you would join us again in future webinars that we have coming up. So thank you, everybody.